Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed speakers, good morning and a very, very warm welcome to this opening session of IF2020, a two-day virtual extravaganza which brings together all sorts of big brains from around the globe to grapple with all sorts of big topics. We have an awful lot on the table for you, from the European Green Deal and green recovery, of course, to the farm and fork strategy, to industrial strategy, the digital transition, sustainable trade, and so much more. Now, not only will we be talking policy alongside some real world solutions, the aim is really some concrete ideas and some concrete output to bring about change. Now, in other words, it's not all talk, it is also action. There'll be plenty of opportunities for you to network, and doubtless some of you early birds will have already been doing this before this session. So my name is Katrina Sichel. I'm a broadcaster and moderator and tap dancer. There you go. I bet you didn't know that. And I have the privilege of moderating this 60-minute session, which is presented by Google with the very, very punchy title, AI EU OK? What next for artificial intelligence in Europe? Now, I will be shortly joined by 5 speakers from the spheres of tech, from policy, from industry, to talk AI. Now, what was once a buzzword, you all know this, is really now very much a reality. Although there is actually a lot of lack of awareness about AI, but I'll come to that shortly, because AI tools are embedded in so many of the products in our everyday lives, so many of the services, and of course in the public sector, police and education and recruitment, to unemployment and border control. And of course, algorithms are running some big operations in some big sectors, from transport and healthcare to energy and manufacturing. Big interest is high, and the public opinion is very prevalent, and not least in the realm of ethics, everything to do with facial recognition to financial products and so on. So what's the context for our discussion? Naturally, the dilemmas for policymakers and for society at large are very real and they're very pressing. And that's what we're going to look at a little bit today. Don't forget, as a background, and I'd like to just remind you of all of this, that on the 19th of February 2020, of course, this year, the European Commission published a white paper aiming to foster a very European ecosystem of excellence and trust in AI, for which there was a public consultation. And one of the biggest issues for people was this risk of discrimination, of bias, of breaching fundamental human rights, of safety, and critically, and this is an issue we'll be looking at here, lack of compensation in terms of liability. Who's liable? When it goes wrong, well, are you compensated? So all of this and finding the right balance between the regulation and the risk-based approach and not squashing innovation is absolutely critical for the EU, and we're going to put that under the spotlight. I mean, look, it already established itself as a global leader for data privacy legislation. Can it do the same with AI? So we're going to look at all of those issues and more. What's human-centric approach? What's responsible AI? And can it really help solve some of the world's pressing issues? So, a couple of housekeeping bits, and I promise I will join my fabulous speakers, ask them to join me. They are much more important than me. We will not be taking questions for this session. That's a rarity for a moderator to be able to have the speakers to herself. However, you are encouraged to visit Google's AI 3D experience in the Festival Forest. And from 2 to 4 p.m. there, you will have an expert who can answer any questions that you might have. Critically, if you're inspired by the people that you're going to meet, and I trust that you will be, please don't forget to post. You can do that on hashtag IF2020 or, of course, at Google Europe. But that is enough from me because I'd love you to meet our speakers. So I trust that you are clapping warmly at home or perhaps in your offices. Joining me today, I have from Google, Fernanda Viegas. She is a senior research scientist and she's co-founder of the People and AI Research, the PAIR team at Google. So welcome to you, Fernanda. We also have Andreas Cleve. He is co-founder and CEO of Corti. Now, for those who don't know, it's a very, very interesting company. Hello, I called you the ninja. Welcome to the ninja. He's looking very cool there. The milk tray man, for those of you who are from the UK. Corti uses advanced voice and pattern recognition technology to assist medical professionals in predicting cases in real time. So it provides them with real intelligent decision support. So that's great to have you here, Andreas, because healthcare is one of those sectors, I think, where people are most afraid and have most opinions about what AI is doing. Julia Fenart. She is joining us, Head of European Affairs at France Digitale. This is the largest startup association in Europe. It's got nearly 2,000 members, nearly 100, more than 100 VCs, and she will be telling you about that a little bit and some of the trends in AI in a moment. We are very, very privileged, and can I please say that they are also both women. It's quite rare to have this very balanced, more than balanced lineup. We have Dita Charanzovà. She is MEP and Vice President of the European Parliament and Vice President of the ALDE Party, so she is joining us. Welcome to you, Dita. And also we have, of course, Eva Maydell. She is MEP from the EPP Group and President of European Movement International, which is the largest organisation of associations and civil societies in Europe. I'll say a little bit more about you, but not too much, so the audience grasps why you're with us when I ask you to answer my opening question. A very warm welcome. We have now about 50 minutes to chat. We've got a lot to get our teeth into, so I'm going to ask you all. I've terrorised you into being super concise, but I can promise you our audience will love you for it. So please don't let me have to ask you to wind up your contributions, good people. So let's just dive in. I'd like to come to Fernanda. I'm going to ask you to open, okay, because this session is presented by Google. So let's start with you. Your work is in machine learning, but what's very important to say, because that's where my first question focuses, is that it's all about improving that human and AI interaction to democratize AI technology. So as I understand it, you've got this very strong feeling about weaving the expectations of society into the design, into the value of the systems. You hold a PhD from MIT Media Lab. I think we can safely say that you are the right person to be kicking things off here. So I think the very important thing to ask you, first of all, is, you know, at Google, you're dealing with responsible human-centered AI. What does that actually mean?
Thank you, Kat, and thank you for having me here. Hello to everyone. So yes, that's a great question. Human-centered AI. What this means in a nutshell is that we need to start going beyond mathematical performance benchmarks. What do I mean by that? Historically speaking, this technology, AI, and specifically machine learning, which I'm just going to say ML from now on, has been judged to work according to accuracy. So mathematical accuracy. How many times is this technology correct when, you know, it decides that there is a cat on a photo, or it decides that a patient might have cancer? So we look at accuracy. This is historically everything that this kind of technology has done. And that's good because we all want accurate systems in our lives. However, once these systems get out of the lab and start to affect people in real life, what you need is you need to go beyond accuracy. You need to go beyond measures of performance, because that's when questions around things like trust calibration, explainability, fairness, those other questions start to creep in. And so human-centered AI is the ability to be thinking ahead when you're designing these systems, to design them already with these questions in mind. The question of trustworthiness, the question of explainability. Can you explain how the system is behaving, why it's making a prediction it is making, for instance? Can you talk about things like fairness and deal with the fact that the world isn't perfect and data isn't perfect? So how do you start to engage with all these questions that, again, will go beyond a simple measure of accuracy? And so this is what human-centered AI means. It means that you have to put work in right away as you start designing these systems. It also means that if you're dealing with a system that hasn't been designed this way, then you need to start thinking, okay, how do I add explainability to the system? How do I allow my users to decide for themselves how much they should trust or not trust a system like this? So I'd say in a nutshell, that's what it is.
It was a good nutshell. And I think that's interesting that you said right at the outset, it's beyond maths. This is design with questions in mind. Now, I will come to everybody else in just a moment. One question for a quick answer there. Okay, you design with questions in mind. Who decides on those questions? How can I trust that what I need is in the head of, I don't know, your software engineer, your algorithm analyst? So how do we ensure that?
Yes. So this is where what we've been calling in my team and at Google, where participatory ML comes in. So what are the processes? What are the tools that we can use and that we can devise so that we make sure that it's not only the engineer, it's not only the machine learning expert who can ask questions, be thinking critically about this technology, and be thinking about the implications of this technology. So we have, for instance, we have developed tools where as a lay person, if you will, a non-machine learning expert, you can probe a system and you can see, oh, how does this system behave for a population where, you know, different portions of this population look very different. And so we're starting to have tools that allow you to probe for these things. And very importantly, these have to be tools where you're not expected to code. You're not expected to have a PhD in math. You're not expected to be an expert in ML, right? So these tools are starting to have to exist. Okay. Another thing are processes.
Very short, please. Go on. Another thing, if you can say it in a couple of sentences. Yep.
Processes. How do we all come together as stakeholders? What kind of conversations do we need to have around things like the mistakes that these systems might make and who these mistakes might affect? So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I know, processes. It's mad. Look at you with your PhD from MIT Media Lab, and I'm going, please say the answer in 21 seconds flat. That's really helpful, isn't it? But thank you. That's been a very clear introduction, and it's a nice segue because you brought up the word trust there, because this is affecting people's lives. So that brings me to Eva, because I think very useful, I think, a way to come to you with my first question. Now, this really is your area, because as far as I understand it, unless your priorities have changed, you focus on enhancing skills creation. This is, you know, we have a big skills gap in Europe in terms of innovation and technology, and supporting all of those entrepreneurs and the investments that go with that support. You're on lots of committees. In fact, you're furiously active, I think, in the Parliament, EPP Rapporteur on data strategy and the implementation of the European Fund for Strategic Investment and the new skills agenda and the influence of technology on the future of the financial sector. So let's say this really is your baby. Tell us, you know, I said there this ecosystem of excellence and trust. If the EU wants to ensure AI is trustworthy, responsible, we just heard from Fernanda, and respects European values, what does that mean for you, picking up from what Fernanda said, putting people at the centre?
Thank you, Katrina. Very glad to be able to join this morning, or this evening for some. As I understand, we are joined from participants all over the world. Well, in practice, this means that we will work towards increasing basically the trust of citizens, of ordinary citizens. Those citizens do not have to be necessarily tech savvy or work in technology, because I think today's challenge is not only who would be creating the next big, software, who would be creating an app that would go viral. It could be any sort of technology that we might need right now. For example, a technology that could actually help us achieve some of the ambitious goals we've put forward in the green, so to say, sector. But if this technology is not perceived as secured, if citizens do not feel that they can trust it, this would create certain issues in making sure that we put those technologies forward for the benefit of societies. if this product has flaws and does not give, for example, the correct picture because of biased data or a biased developer, then this product might end up being banned by regulators and distrusted by society. So if you think of it, almost all of the big companies, but also emerging trendy apps around the world nowadays have in a way faced a backlash on the way that their data was, that they handle data. And this diminished in a way the trust people have in technology. And it is not only a company issue. It's not only someone that is a developer. It's not only their issue to tackle. It's also a political and policy issue as well. It legitimizes all efforts of policymakers to bring on board tech solutions that can help us actually emerge having a cleaner air, having healthier societies, or a smarter and more efficient ways to come out of the COVID-19 crisis, for example.
Okay. Thank you. And I will come. So thank you very much for just putting your finger on, just touching on, you talked about cleaner air, healthier societies. We're going to come to Andreas soon because I want to talk about what this means in affecting people's lives. But before I move on, is that why? So you talked about, people's trust being eroded. There's been too many incidents where people see, no, this isn't happening as it should, whether it's my data, whether it's facial recognition. There are too many stories out there. Is this why the approach that's being put forward now by the Commission is very much on the monitoring, the control? Come on, you've got to prove yourself, the certification, particularly in those high-risk AI sectors. Just for a very short answer, please. Is that why? Is that what's driving it? And is it right? Is it the right approach?
Well, in a way, this is it indeed what is driving it, because as I said, if citizens perceive that a product is in a way biased or not trustworthy in the way it handles your data, you get a backlash from society. And then it's an issue that is perceived that policymakers should have had their say and tackle it in one way or another. So this is why we see efforts being undertaken in this domain. And I think it has to be very important that we work closely with the developers, with the companies that put forward technologies, that there's more transparency, more understanding of how those technologies actually take certain decisions, because as policymaker, for me, is very important, as I said, to have those technology enhance our societies and our lives or our economies. But if they're not trusted, they would never have the impact they could actually have and deliver. So it's a very fine balance, and it's a difficult balance, but I'm confident that it could be achieved, but there should be a will from both sides, right? So on one hand, from the company sides, the companies and the developers need to be willing to discuss, but on the other hand, it should not be also a restrictive way that policymakers take towards these issues, because those sort of discussions are going to be present on our table more and more often, because the technological development is advancing by the minute and by the hour, and it's way faster than before. So we need to be prepared to find good solutions that will not hamper innovation, but on the other hand would provide enough regulatory certainty for citizens and companies.
Thank you. And you're absolutely right. And I hope, I'd like to come to Dita, please, because I think it makes sense to just stay within that policy space and the EU policy space for the moment. Now, you're a vice president of the European Parliament, and as I said, of the ALDE party, and you're actually serving a second mandate, just so our audience can get a sense of who you are within the liberal group Renew Europe. You're a former diplomat. You've also worked at the Council of Europe, and you are Renew Europe spokesperson in the Parliament for the Internal Market and Consumer Protection Committee, and you're also substitute member in the International Trade Committee, and also, according to Politico, among the top 20 most influential women shaping Brussels politics in 2020. So thank you very much for joining us. I want to give you a bit of a chance to come up on that, because you're saying, yes, it requires transparency and conversation amongst all stakeholders, and everybody's got to do their bit. But so often I hear, you know, the citizen, the consumer being very frustrated with that, saying, but then no one really sort of, it always becomes someone else. So what do you think about this approach that's being taken in terms of the regulation, but leaving that room for innovation?
So good morning, everybody, and thank you for this question, because this is really one of the most important one, how to take everybody on board while we regulate. It's not only about AI, it's also about other topics. When it comes to AI, I think we have already managed to discuss this issue for some months. And you are right that we need to find and strike the right balance. I'm very liberal, so I'm very cautious every time we speak about regulation, especially in the digital field. What we need to find is the right balance here between security, between the innovation on one hand, but also privacy on the other hand. And there where we are trying to find the right balance. We need to wait what the final proposal of the Commission will be. So far, what we know is from the white paper that they would like to regulate based on two factors, two issues. One is high risk sectors and application, and second, application. But still, there are a lot of questions that arise from this approach, because you can have low risk sector with high risk application. And there, my point and my, my focus would always be that we have to regulate where we really see we undermine the fundamental rights and freedoms. Of course, there is a lot of discussion what we do with facial recognition. But here, again, we have a lot of regulation in place already. You mentioned GDPR, but there are many others. Maybe we need to update some of them. I think about liability, for instance. But I would be really cautious when we speak about regulation of AI. For some sectors, the overregulation can be really a killing approach. And perhaps one last bit to mention that while in Europe, we are really advancing with the regulation on AI, we are thinking how to make also the European approach a different one than the one we see in Asia, for instance. Where I see the Europe lacking behind is innovation and the competitiveness, I would say, competitiveness, research and innovation approach. So this has to go hand in hand. On one hand, regulation, but on the other hand, also the money, both public and private, we spend to really speed up and scale up in Europe.
Thank you, and for bringing in a lot of points there that we might be able to come back and do more than scratch the surface. What I do want to just pull out is this issue of, if we look at high risk sectors, if we look at areas, if we regulate where fundamental rights are at risk or where there is harm, there is a risk of death even. I mean, you didn't say that, I'm bringing this in. Of course, we need to take a very granular approach, a little bit like Fernanda was saying when she was saying we need to ask the right questions, sit and think in detail, bring in the right people. You need to think with a sector, and I'm coming to Andreas now, for example, healthcare, high risks. But if we're talking about putting in a patient meeting within the healthcare sector, that's low risk. So I think that's what you're getting at, aren't you? There are different applications, and even within the high risk, there might be lower risk. So how do we see that? Did I grasp that correctly? That it really needs quite a detailed, deep dive to ascertain what's high risk, what's low risk within high risk. It can't sort of have a very broad approach.
Yes, indeed. That's the main question that we need to ask together with the industry. How do we define the high-risk applications in low-risk sectors? You mentioned some examples. Of course, I'm in the politics, so I can mention also, for instance, the political campaign and the role of Facebook. One would say that political advertising is low risk, but when you have a campaign before the elections, it changes. We have seen a lot of fake news, deep fake generated by AI on social media. So that's one issue. Second issue that we also already see is, for instance, online employment, where you can have certain applications discriminated based on the gender, based on some other criteria. So this is where we really also need the inputs of the industry, that we work together and that we develop it together. Because at the end of the day, and I'm thinking about Black Lives Matter, for instance, campaign, which basically stopped some advanced systems developed by big companies because they realized that they need to take into account also these current developments in the society. So, I mean, we need to work together, and that's maybe my final remark to your question.
Thank you. And I know I'm not very good at asking one sentence questions. So thank you very much. And also let me raise here, and also because, I'm Belgian and a Brit, but obviously a very good example is what we've just seen in the UK over the summer with the whole hoo-ha with the algorithm and the exam grades. So this is not just, you talked about regulating where freedoms are at high risk. That was discriminatory, that was random there, and we see already that the response from government has not been very transparent and consistent, which brings us into this whole liability and compensation issue. But we'll park that there. I'm going to come to Andreas. You've heard a lot, so that's quite nice, of what comes before. So you're going to tell a little bit more about your company, which is using this incredibly cutting-edge technology to assist medical professionals really in predicting cases in real time. But just to say, you're also chairman and founder of Nordic AI, which was created as an anchor specifically for Nordic machine learning and AI community. Tell me, Andreas, you're in a bar with me. I know nothing about your company. In a few sentences, tell us what it does, and tell us specifically, and within that medical healthcare sector, how it is helping to address some of the key societal challenges.
Of course, thank you so much for having me. I represent Corti, and we've built a technology that's a digital assistant, which you can have inside your patient consultations. So it will listen in what's being said and shared. And there it will compare the patient to millions of other patients to try to see if it can help make the right diagnostic or the right assessment. So the goal of the company was to build a technology that would learn from every prior patient consultation to give a technology that would actually can give to people who haven't got access to expert healthcare, as I do here in Copenhagen. And we're 55 people. We're from 19 nationalities, working out of Europe, all of us at this point. And I think that's a very European vision. The basic idea of actually having access to something where there was nothing, actually helping on a problem where we have a lot of impact on the trajectory of a patient going through healthcare. And we actually proved through expert-driven clinical trials that this kind of technology, having it as sort of a co-pilot during a patient consultation or an emergency call, we can actually lower the mortality rate, we can increase the survival rate, we can ensure that there are less implicit bias, which will, of course, in turn mean that we all get a more fair access to healthcare.
Okay, two quick questions there. You said you can prove through clinical trials. Can you give us an example of that?
So when we started building on this vision, a lot of people in the healthcare space was rightfully very doubtful that some computer geeks from Copenhagen would ever find out how to actually build a digital assistant that could have a patient consultation. So we knew we needed to prove it, and we're firm believers in the fact that although explainability is really, really important, the true fact is that a lot of what we're doing here is very, very complex. And maybe it's not for everyone to read a research paper once in a while, diving deep into confusion matrix, but the people who need to use this, they are. So we went in and started working with the healthcare professionals of, both here in Copenhagen and in Seattle, in the US, later in Sweden and France and Italy, and actually build a set of advisors throughout the healthcare sector who this technology was interesting to. So they took it to a trial and actually proved that by implementing this kind of co-pilot for healthcare interviews on emergency calls. They could have the AI listen in while somebody called 911 or 112. And during that call, the AI would help the operator sitting at 112 or 911 actually come to the conclusion on whether it was a critical case of, let's say, a cardiac arrest faster than they would before. And in many cases, when they didn't diagnose it, they actually did now. So all of a sudden, we changed the fate of people who wouldn't get any kind of help because it wasn't experienced as that critical. And that is the big shift here, that all of a sudden you can go in and prove through clinical trials that computers have a value add. I am a patient, right? And I'm a European patient, and I don't want to talk to a computer anytime soon. But I definitely want my healthcare professionals to be super powered by millions of second opinions from millions of other patients.
So, but the obvious question is there. So you're talking about co-pilot. You said you actually used very powerful words there, changed people's fate, their journey, their trajectory. But the obvious question is how do you get their permission? How do I say, oh, it's okay that my interview is listened in? Well, as if I'm coming with something really, very emotional, very sensitive. How on earth do you create that ecosystem where this can actually work?
So the God honest fact is that there is no room in European legislation post GDPR for a company like us to offer this service ourselves. So the thing we could do if we wanted to stay in Europe, which we wanted because we're strong believers in the union, was to offer the technology to providers who were already doing this kind of interaction. So they already had a contract between patients and themselves. That might be an emergency department. Mm-hmm. They'll be deploying our technology on their end, on their premises, on their calls, on their contracts, and we'll be supporting them since we cannot offer this kind of service ourselves.
Okay, so just before I come, thank you very much. I will come back to you. I'm sure there are people listening in who've got a gazillion questions and I'm not going to be hitting all of them, but let me try and hear from everybody first. Julia, you've been super patient. I just want to see if one of our MEPs wants to respond to what Andreas just said there. You know, with GDPR, that is an issue in terms of using this tech in the EU. Did either Eva or Dita, did you want to respond to that? No. I'd need to see you raise your hand if you do. No? Okay. So we leave that there for a moment. I'm going to come to Julia because, again, very, very interesting. You are, as I said at the outset, head of European affairs at Digitale, this largest startup association in Europe. You coordinate a very, very big task force of AI and data startups. And you're also leading something called the United Tech of Europe, which is a coalition of startup associations. So I'd like to ask you, you're calling yourself the first French and European tech community. So tell us a little bit about what you're about. I do know that your drivers really are to help all of these startups to grow, whether it's funding, whether it's networking, keeping that social and environmental impact in mind. So tell us a little bit about the company. And then the obvious question coming on what I've asked is, you're looking for a particular favorable regulatory environment. So given what you've heard, what does that mean for you?
Thank you so much, Katrina. A few words about France Digitale and about what we do. We help startups with three very important things, which is accessing funds, accessing cash, investors. We help them accessing businesses, getting business partners, getting contracts, selling their services and their products, and we help them to recruit talents. So these are three of our missions. And also, we try also to speak with one single voice and to represent them to the authorities, French and European. So coming back to your question, I would say that France Digitale is more the largest startup association, maybe not the largest tech community. I'll try to be a bit more modest. And, you know, we met with the cabinet of Commissioner Breton in January. And, you know, it was very interesting because we were asked actually to be very active in this debate. We are asked to really carry the voice of startups. Because usually in Brussels, some people might consider that a regulator meets with, you know, a German industry in the morning, they meet with a big tech company in the afternoon, and then with a small company in the evening, and their job is done. You know, I think we all disagreed with that. For France Digitale, a good regulation in AI is really to be constructed and build with those that actually will apply that regulation on the ground, like Fernanda here or like Andreas here. So that's really important for us. And that's why we have actually created that task force of 100 AI and data startups, so that they can actually work on that project and on that piece of legislation to see if that's technically feasible and how that would work for them, actually. So after several months of work, I think I may summarize the opinion of startups, saying that they are actually in favor of the introduction of new regulatory requirements, but for the most risky applications only. So we support the Commission's approach that an AI application should generally be considered high risk if cumulative criteria of the sector and intended use are met. So just to give you a very short example on that. Exactly. Yeah. So we work with a very nice startup that is called Doctrine, which is a legal tech. And when we think about legal tech, people, are immediately afraid of predictive justice, which, they might be right. But, that startup, Doctrine, they use AI to anonymize and to browse justice data through a search engine, which is not risky per se. And that's why these cumulative criteria are very important.
Okay, thank you very much. And I just while I have you with me, and because you've been so patient waiting till the end, what, the title is really what's next. That's what we were, that's the title of our session, EU AI, okay, where are we going next? So anything that your member companies are telling you about, where AI is going next, or what we need to be seeing? I mean, it's a jungle and there's already a lot. You're talking about, some people really re-regulate, some no, just tweak it, some no, kind of happy as it is. What else?
I think I'll try to go a bit more into the polemic and the risky themes here, because I think I've noticed three consistent trends in the discussions we had on values, on sovereignty, and on green AI. And that last one is not as risky per se. And on the values, I think European startups really want to prove that there is a third way in the way of doing business between US and China. So, ethical AI is a big debate amongst them. Privacy, transparency, explainability is, all this, they're really trying to incorporate that by design when they create their company, when they create their startup. On sovereignty, or, I'd rather maybe talk about strategic autonomy. I think that's the word where it's now used more in Brussels. But, storing their data for AI use is increasingly a concern. And the recent news on Privacy Shield really didn't help that. And that's, a debate that is currently going on in the startup community. And third one, on green AI, I think this is something they're really thinking about. It's something they really care about. So I think what's next is really a big reflection about these three things.
And give me an example of what green AI could be. I mean, I can imagine, but give me an example of how AI would be deployed with that in mind.
Some startups are really thinking about how they could produce algorithms and develop them in a way that is less consuming in terms of energy. So by design, creating an algorithm that is more eco-friendly.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Now, I've got my eyes on the clock, ladies and gentlemen. We've got about 18 minutes because we can't be late. So I'm going to try not to do this in the order again. And please feel free, lovely speakers, to raise your hands. But there are a few issues we haven't touched on that I'd like to try and tease out. But you're welcome, obviously, to input and to ask questions of your fellow speakers. I'd like to come back to Fernanda because we've heard this now from Dita. We heard it there from Julia, this issue of Europe's third way, trying to differentiate itself. And part of that is because of trust. We heard there the example from Dita about Facebook. So you guys are also in the firing line and you talk extremely eloquently, and I do not doubt in terms of, like you say, weaving in societal expectations, asking the right questions to do no harm. But what do you think about this differentiating And is one of the drives behind it because there is a lack of trust with these big giants like yourselves?
Thanks, Kat. Yeah, so I think trust is a big question, and it's a question you put it in an interesting way, in the sense that, you know, big tech. That's one part of the question, but the other part is trust for this technology, no matter where it comes from. From a startup, from the government even itself, from educators, and you name it. So I think we can talk about trust in different ways, but one of the points that I think would be nice to highlight here is when we talk about trust, we all agree that we want trustworthy systems, right? But one of the questions that is usually missing is, how do we get there concretely? In practice, how do I create these products that are more trustworthy? What does that mean? One of the things I think is very clear so far is that, at least in my mind, trust and explainability for AI go hand in hand. If you don't have a clue about how the system is behaving, it's going to be really hard to trust the system. And this is not just me saying. We've already started seeing this. We see this at Google. We see this in research projects. So for instance, and I would love to talk to Andreas about this at some point if we have time. But in healthcare, for instance, and Google has been working with AI-enabled projects in research in healthcare, one of the things we've noticed is that no matter how accurate your system is, doctors will be very quick to dismiss what your system is saying unless they trust it, and rightly so, right? They're making high-stake calls, and they need to trust the system. So some of our research has found out that, for instance, one of the things that helps a lot for doctors to start trusting a system like this is to better understand what has the system seen before. What is the kind of data the system has been trained on? And so, for instance, the doctors want to understand, is there a bias in the data set? One of the examples we found in our research is, and let's forget AI for a moment. Doctors have been dealing with this forever. So when doctors come up against a complex case that they're trying to diagnose, a lot of times they will ask a second opinion. They will ask for a colleague. What do you think? Do you think there is cancer here? And if so, what level of cancer? 1, 2, 3, you tell me. When they do that, the really important bit is that they know the person they are asking for a second opinion, and they know their bias. What do I mean by that? I mean that they know if that second doctor is conservative or not. So when I get, as a doctor, when I get back a second opinion and it says, yes, I think there is cancer and I think it's level 3, Gleason 3. If I am a conservative doctor, if my colleague is a conservative doctor, I take that into account. And I know how to work with that. So part of what the doctors want to see in this research that we started understanding is they want to understand, okay, so your system, when it gives me a forecast, a prediction, what kinds of cases has the system been trained on before, right? How conservative is it? And these are things we can do. These are technically feasible things.
Okay, thank you. And of course, all of that presumes when you say, I know that's a conservative doctor, it also presumes how well we read other people and what our perception is of other people, which is a whole other Pandora's box. But Andreas raised a hand there, so I'd like him to be able to come in, please.
And thank you, Fernanda. Really good point, and a big fan of you and your team's work. And I think just to play a bit of devil's advocate on it, I think when I think of the word trustworthiness, for me, it's more of a virtue, right? Because it's my perception of trust still. So it's a state of being. I subscribe to something or someone I truly believe in since they live up to some kind of standard defined by me. And I think this is where this gets hard, right? Because in Europe, if we're trying to find a pan-European framework for a state of being we deem trustworthy, we miss the point of it. And I think you're not missing the point, but I'm worried that people will using the wrong words. So I think one thing that you're asking here and one thing you're stating here is that that they want to see the examples. They want to know what a doctor is basing their opinion on. I absolutely agree, but that is not happening today, right? So we all build what we call expertise, which we call in turn professional intuition, which is implicit bias. So at the top of the food chain, people are being treated by doctors, nurses, professionals, advocates, and accountants with implicit bias. And in the bottom of the food chain, nobody has access to these people. So I think the two things we need to start addressing more than trustworthiness is transparency, to your point, because what you're saying is exactly we need to know what's going in there. And I think the thing we do have in Europe, right, is that we actually have public opinion, although we're very different countries. I sit here in Copenhagen with 19 nationalities, many of them European, but we still have a basic idea of how we want to be treated as patients. And remember, Corti is a small company, but we're still very much bound by public opinion. So if our customers, our patients don't like Corti, we'll go out of business. And my only worry would be that, first off, we skew the conversation about the top 2% of the problem. All of us that can afford great healthcare that might see bias, but what about the rest of the world that has nothing, where AI actually could make a difference? And secondly, I'm really worried that we end up in a situation where we forget that we are also patients. And the many European companies, we're still bound by public opinion. And not to shoot on you at all, Fernanda, I'm a big fan, but Google, Facebook, and other companies, we have seen this time and time again, that although the majority of the public discourse is maybe not that positive, you're still doing great in business. And that's where public opinion fails, because we have no impact and we are having a hard time creating transparency.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to give our MEPs the chance to weigh in here. So Dita, yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. And I carefully listened to what Fernanda has been saying. And I think the key here when we speak about the trust is to say people will trust what they can understand. So we really need to find a way how to explain from the young generation to the old generation what the AI is about. There is a lot of conspiracy, there is a lot of fear about the people, and people will not accept something that they don't understand. For me as a politician or someone who is responsible for legislation, of course, there is also a lot of responsibility on my shoulders too. I think the problem of digital literacy, the fact that we have really kind of a lost generation when it comes to digital field, this is where we as politicians need to step in and help. But then it's also for the companies to give exactly these examples and explain on very simple examples what the AI can do, how it can help, and there is no reason to fear.
Thank you. And I will come to you, Fernanda, because it might be just, again, we have 10 minutes, ladies and gentlemen, so keep it nice and tight, please. But I just want to, the European Consumer Organization, then I will come to Eva, and then I will come to Fernanda. Thank you, Eva. I see you raise your hand. Very good point, because you have to trust what you understand. BUC, the European Consumer Organization, carried out a survey. You may know these statistics. And 21% of people had never heard of AI. 43% feel ill-informed. 50% think companies are using AI to manipulate human decisions. Most people think that they should have the right to say no to automated decision making, but that level, like you say there, of lack of awareness or feeling ill-informed is very, very real. Eva, you wanted to come in here.
Yes, I wanted to come in because with a couple of more, so to say, examples, perhaps, which pose difficulty for policymakers to be real, digital leaders as well. Because I think that in a way, Europe and not only could have excelled even further if certain technologies were put in place. But all of a sudden, very technical things such as 5G, for example, or now when we talk about AI, have become very central to the public discussion, but not with the sort of examples we are hearing today, for example, in this discussion, but the sort of scaremongering examples that feel people that make people feel threatened, that make people feel that their information is used in a way that is not right. And therefore, we need to make sure that the technical debate is dealt in a technical level, but the actual discussion in society is about how these technologies can enhance us. And the work of the legislator and the authorities and institutions is to make sure that citizens are protected. Just like, if someone gets into someone's house uninvited, there's procedure that is followed by the authorities. And that should be the same if someone enters your online space in one way or another, or the data you generate online. There are clear rules also on that, but citizens need to feel more reassured. And it's a normal thing, it's a new thing, but we cannot get into the technical debate because, as Katrina was stating some of the numbers that some people have not understood or don't know what AI is. Well, imagine if the first article they read is about how things went wrong because of a certain algorithm. Well, they would be scared forever if that is followed by a nice story, how, a little girl did something and because of the algorithm, this and this happened. She would perhaps, her family or whoever reads it, will be not very trustworthy towards technology. So it all depends on what sort of narrative is used in the public space. And therefore, it's both the developers, but also policymakers that, we need a constructive approach towards everything that's new in society.
Thank you. I mean, I think that's interesting, a constructive approach. I'll come to Julia because she raised her hand. And let me just put it out there in case anyone can come back on this, and I'll leave it out there and listen to Julia. And then we're coming to the last 5 minutes. What I do want to say, when you say, you've got different kinds of stories going out there, one critical bit in all this is, of course, you've got the paths to, you've got the rules. We spoke about transparency, Andreas, that's actually more important than trust. We spoke about understanding, but it's also about liability. My humble feeling as a general, as a citizen, is that, when things go wrong, very often there is no, it wasn't me, mate, it was you. No, that's going to take 5 years and cost billions. So there isn't compensation. It isn't clear. My feeling is people can tolerate more if they feel heard. And another good example here is the exam fiasco in the UK. How was that then dealt with? So that whole liability issue and compensation is very critical. So if anybody wants to weigh in there, I'd be happy to hear that as a last point. But let me come to Julia. You raised your hand there. Thank you.
Absolutely. I actually really agree with Eva and also what Dita said on that we really should tackle all these myths that are going around artificial intelligence. But we must not only regulate, we must also stimulate AI in Europe, at least. When I was speaking about helping startups getting access to funds, a reality that we must all be aware today in Europe is that our startup will struggle to raise more than 30 million euros. There are very, very few VC funds in Europe that will be able to put that amount of money on the table. Also, startups need to get access to businesses, as I said, to big contracts. And, the current public procurement framework in Europe is very limitative for them. That's really something we must also work on so that they can expand their business, so that they can scale their businesses. And I think, it has been highlighted, but the heart of all of that is talent. And we've run a survey and we've realized that recruitment is actually the first challenge encountered by startups. We all know how, if it's already hard for Google to recruit a data scientist, imagine for a startup, it's a nightmare. So I think we really need a European soft power strategy to retain the talents that we have. France has one of the best engineering school and mathematics track in Europe and in the world. We need to retain these talents so that they stay. We need to attract talents from abroad, and we need to raise new talents. And I really appreciated the fact that Dita also mentioned the digital literacy challenge that we have all here. So if we tackle these three things, I think plus regulation, plus stimulation, I think we'll get a friendly environment for AI startups in Europe.
Thank you. We have 3 minutes, ladies and gentlemen. So Fernanda, you've got to be very, very brief. I think you wanted to come in. It's literally 3 or 4 sentences because I don't want to leave this without that idea. What do you want to leave the audience with to think about for what's next for AI? So Fernanda, the next 3 sentences are yours first. Thank you.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah,
so that's okay.
I know.
So I think my parting thought would be that my hope is that the EU looks at this technology as a powerful new intellectual tool that we have at our disposal to try to better understand the complexities and the challenges around us in the world. So things like, how do you cure cancer? How do you predict earthquakes? How do you deal with climate change? These are things that have eluded us for decades, if not hundreds of years, right? So we now have one more powerful intellectual tool that we can use to try to do better. I would love for, as regulators think about this, and they should, just to embrace also the possibilities and the promise of this technology. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Andreas, yes. I was coming to you next. We're so in tune, Andreas. Yes, so in tune. The floor is yours.
We're always in tune. That's so weird. No, I was actually just banging a bit at what Fernanda said. I absolutely agree. And I think that's so important. And finally, I think let's not we all have a hard time explaining quantum computers, and many people will have a hard time explaining electricity or how their light bulb works. And this is the same thing. Just because we call it AI and not powerful statistics, it's not here to hurt us. It's still built by people, and people are patients. And we all want the best things for all of us. So let's stay true to that vision of helping each other and stay transparent.
Eva.
Well, I just want to go back to our panel topic. AI EU, is everything okay, right? And I think we pinpointed during this panel some of the very, very key basis for everything being more than okay. So what I would like to see in the next couple of years is this same energy that's being shared here, shared or also policy making arena as well, into understanding that restrictions are perhaps needed, but we have the liability principle. We also can run data quality checks, for example, but we also, as some of our representatives from the development area have said, we need to empower innovation. We need to retain talent. We need to be part of this leading society that can retain talent, make sure that in the same time our regulation fosters innovation in order for us to be at the forefront of what's coming. And ideally, it would also be the moment when those technical discussion will remain for the actual experts in order for society to be able to embrace some of the developments that would enable us to be way more competitive and way more successful. So thank you.
Thank you very much. You've got 2 more. I've got Julia, and I will end with Dita. Julia, Dita, you really do have 30 seconds. Otherwise, I'll be by Mark, who's going to host. The panel is coming up at 11:05. So, Julia.
I think I would just sum up, saying that we should not regulate without stimulating at the same time. And in order to become European AI champions, startups, as I said, they need more funding capacity. They need more access to important contracts like public procurement, and they need to be able to attract and recruit talent much more easily.
Thank you. And Dita, what's your final takeaway? What do we need to be think about where we're going next?
Since I have like 2 or 3 seconds, I'll try to be very brief. I would just say, don't fear artificial intelligence and embrace the enhanced intelligence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For me, there is a very key message that's overriding. It is not to be feared, but there is a very also key message that in order not to fear it, you've got to get the right kind of regulation and other measures in place, which, as Fernanda said, as Julia said, require, and Andreas, an awful lot of thinking. It really is highly granular in terms of, and getting the right people to do that thinking. We've had examples there of all of these issues: climate change, earthquakes, healthcare, air pollution. But then you've got to get the right people, the beneficiaries, in at the right moment to be part of that conversation if you really, really want to keep trust and transparency, as Andreas said. I think it was interesting to say, thinking about where you regulate. Is it about fundamental rights? Is it about other areas? How do we define harm in the different sectors? And to drill down in those sectors, okay, there might be high risk, but is everything on the same level as high risk? We don't know. Absolutely hear the message from Julia about funding. You know, it's all very well to sort of be looking at the policy and the regulatory side, but if there's no one to bring this forward and keep Europe competitive with its peers across the world, well, then what are we going to be doing? So I've just recapped a very, very little bit there. Before I close, I just want to thank all of you very much for coming and giving lending your voices and your expertise to give such a punchy and dynamic opening to this two-day event. I thank Google for presenting the event, and of course to the festival organisers working furiously hard behind the scenes to put it all together. This session was the tip of the iceberg. Don't forget, you can visit Google's AI 3D experience in the festival forest. There's lots going on there, and there is going to be an AI expert online. And another tip, keep your eye on the main festival chat channel, because speakers, and it might be some of these ones, do post links to interesting documents and things to read. And of course, if you've been inspired by all this, do post, do tweet, IF2020 or at Google Europe. So it was an absolute pleasure to share the screen with all of you. Thank you very much. We did only scratch the surface. Thank you very much for all of you who are joining from literally the four corners of the globe. Up next, 11:05 sharp here on the main stage. One Policy Place is presenting the highly topical, and in fact we heard about Black Lives Matter there in the course of our conversation as a good example. We've got the highly topical, is Brussels really united in diversity? Not to be missed. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and perhaps I will see you again. Goodbye.
Thank you, goodbye.
Bye.